Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Roundtable Collaboration in the Time of COVID-19, Digital Collectives to Support Teaching, Outreach, and Research. While we are spread out all over the country, I would like to start by acknowledging my presence here in Los Angeles on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielina Tongva peoples, who are the past and present custodians of the lands that make up this place, Tawangr. My name is Elizabeth Drummond, and I am Associate Professor and Chair of History at Loyola Marymount University here in Los Angeles. I will be the moderator for this panel. I want to just begin with a few likely now very familiar housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, so if you do not want to be visible and you've all done this, turn off your video. Please also mute yourself if you are not speaking. We have enabled live captioning. If you go down to the bottom of the Zoom window, you can click on the CC icon and enable the subtitles. I think that they also come up fairly automatically in Feedloop. So we're going to begin the roundtable with brief presentations on each of our projects, followed by what we hope is a vibrant discussion. If a question occurs to you as we are speaking, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A. Feel free to introduce yourself, to pop it into the chat, I should say. Feel free to introduce yourself through the chat as well. Just a little framing to get us started. In March 2020, as universities closed their campuses in response to COVID-19, instructors, public history practitioners, and students scrambled to navigate the sudden shift to remote teaching and learning and tried to cope with the upheaval in their daily lives. Instructors quickly realized that they needed practical tips for remote teaching and ideas for assignments and projects that could be adapted for online learning. As libraries, museums, and archives closed, they scoured the internet in search of digitized sources, texts, images, films, and more, and digital projects for use in online courses. At the same time, educators in historical societies, in museums, and at historic sites pivoted online to continue their missions while closed to the public. The sheer volume of materials, thought pieces, and listicles about online education presented their own challenges. How to sift through everything to find quality resources and proven approaches. In the process, historians and public historians and faculty drew on each other for ideas, resources, and support. Informal networking developed into more formalized and organized responses to the crisis. This roundtable will focus on three such efforts: digital repositories created to support educators in the transition to online teaching, learning, and programming, a kind of parallel to the efforts of public history practitioners, archivists, and museum professionals who have developed rapid response collecting projects in times of crisis and applying the same sense of civic responsibility to collating pedagogical resources for peers. While these initiatives had their origins as stopgap emergency projects, by providing spaces for collaboration and sharing, they also promise to transform, or have the potential to transform, how we work by integrating digital resources and tools into how we think, research, write, and teach. So the first project is the American Historical Association's Remote Teaching Resources site, which will be presented by Sarah Jones-Weichsel, the Director of Research and Publications at the AHA. She was previously a project historian at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where she co-curated with Amanda Moniz Who Pays for Education? She was a 2018-2019 Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Wolf Humanities Center. Her research, teaching, and museum work focuses on United States history and material culture, and her scholarship on the American Civil War era has appeared in several collected volumes and peer-reviewed journals. Weichsel was awarded her PhD by the Department of History at the University of Chicago, an MA in American Material Culture from the Winter Third program at the University of Delaware, and a BA with distinction in history from Yale University. Sarah.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And thank you especially for bringing all of us together to talk about the resources that we have go ahead and talk to you a little bit about how our project came to be. So as thousands of instructors were racing to improvise web-based teaching alternatives last March, the American Historical Association started working to find ways we could help. And under the leadership of our Director of Academic and Professional Affairs, Dr. Emily Swafford, we were awarded support from the National Endowment for the Humanities through the CARES Act. That allowed us at the AHA to launch our project called Confronting a Pandemic, Historians and COVID-19 in June. Confronting a Pandemic is a series of virtual programs and 2 new online resources. One of those is our bibliography of historians' responses to COVID-19. And the other is the project that I'm going to talk about today, the AHA's remote teaching resources. So the AHA owes the idea for the remote teaching resources, or as we tend to call the RTR, since it's a bit of a mouthful, to Professor Ada Palmer at the University of Chicago, an AHA member who worked in conjunction with the AHA to create a teaching wiki for educators to share digital resources. She had the sense that many instructors were improvising the same alternatives or recreating things that already existed elsewhere. And she was seeing instructors scrambling to prepare online readings and record lectures on the same topics, all with unfamiliar equipment, while also facing the intimidating vacuum of the empty room. So a central location online could let historians share resources. Of course, there's countless resources that are already available online, but they're often hard to find. They're scattered across websites of innumerable institutes, museums, projects, and schools. And those resources and the ability to locate them, we've all found, has become newly relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic, as more instructors are having to teach remotely. So when I was brought on board the project, my first thing was to hire a team of researchers to convert this wiki into a website and to develop it into a set of resources that was vetted by professional historians and designed specifically to assist instructors in teaching remotely online. One of the key aspects of the remote teaching resources is that it is vetted. So every site that's included in our larger website has been thoroughly gone through by a professional historian with expertise in that particular field of teaching. So we hired this team of part-time researchers who have expertise in fields as varied as African American history, early modern, North African history, the history of East Asia, Latin American history, US history, world history, material culture, public history. And the researchers, in addition to these fields, also brought experience working in museums, in K through 16 education, teaching AP courses, and teaching at a variety of institutions. So we currently have hundreds of resources, and there are more yet to come. And this is the site that has resulted from our work over the past several months. The remote teaching resources goal is to help historians develop and teach remote courses without reinventing the wheel. So it compiles accessibility guides. Let's see, let me back up a minute here. So we have accessibility guides, remote teaching pedagogy resources, and material that's specific to a really wide range of geographic locations, themes, time periods, and then a wide variety of resource types. It's tailored specifically towards college instructors, but has been expanded over the course of the past several months to include a lot of resources that are great for secondary education as well. So the other focus, in addition to helping people to adapt to the online format, was to collect primary, secondary, and tertiary historical sources that were organized by period, field, region, and topic. And those sources appeared in a range of formats: film lectures, podcasts, conference discussions, online museum exhibits, web-based walking tours, even film performances. And we also have sample lesson plans, syllabi, assignments, primary sources that have discussion questions, and a really, really wide range of digital history projects. We've also found that in addition to the way in which instructors are using this kind of assuaging the Sunday night anxiety, people are looking at it for both teaching remotely, but as they're moving back into classrooms, they're also really working to use it as a resource to help them to just, prep for the week. So rather than having to search for and assess the quality of the online materials, instructors can visit the AHA's website, knowing that the materials that they find there are really reliable. So as an example of how you might use this site, can take a look at museum collections. And you can scroll through and cover additional options over the course of time. Each of our resources has a very brief description, as well as the institution and or person who is responsible for creating it. All of the dates are when they were uploaded to our website. It's always a question that I get. And once you click on it, you get a larger description, as well as all of the ways in which it has been tagged. So you'll know that if you're looking at Ellen Feingold and Lee Gardner's Money in Exchange in West Africa, that you'll be looking at something that is applicable from 1600 to the present, that addresses topics of race and ethnicity, slavery, empires, and that you'll find museum collections as well as readings. And once you click on the link, that immediately takes you off of the AHA's website and to the actual resource. Okay, so what have been some of the challenges? The first major challenge was vetting. We needed to establish a vetting criteria. And that was based on the AHA's core competencies and learning outcomes, which was developed through a process called the AHA's Tuning Project. And we went through that and asked questions that would allow people to identify the site as being grounded in historical scholarship, attributing its sources, and asking whether or not it aligned with the history's core competencies and learning outcomes. We established a few things that were a red flag. If something didn't meet a particular requirement, it was a full stop. If there were questionable things, we would flag it for another team member to take a look at. And the other challenge was, how were we going to vet these hundreds of submissions that were coming in by email through our affiliated societies, through the AHA research team's own searching online, and then through our submission website? So we established a way to collect all of those and then worked with Airtable as our platform to add in the resources and to go through and tag them, to provide any additional information that was needed as we were in the process of vetting. And then ultimately wrote a few sentence summaries of the resources, ensured hyperlinks were active, and then we edited and uploaded to our website. Some ongoing challenges for us have been that we have not gotten as many classroom-ready resources as we had hoped that we would. And we're continuing to work on encouraging people to submit those kinds of resources, things like lesson plans or a set of discussion questions with sources. And the other challenge is that we know that people are using it. We know that we have thousands of page views, but we don't know a lot about how people are using it in their classrooms. And we have, some idea just based on hearsay and from feedback from people, but we haven't put in place an actual assessment tool at this point. So that's something else that we want to consider looking into. I think that that's one of the opportunities for the future, is to learn more about how people are using this site and to think about how we can expand it. And as I had mentioned before, we're finding that as people are returning to the classroom, that this continues to be a really helpful resource to them. And so we want to think about what the use of the AHA's remote teaching resources is beyond the eventual end of the pandemic. And one of the ways that we're working to do that is to continue to think about how we can further develop those classroom-ready resources where we might have particular sites that are already on the AHA's RTR, and we're going to be looking at how we might add additional documents or feedback from others who have actually used that site in their classroom and would like to offer some ideas for other instructors as well. So that's basic overview of how the remote teaching resources came to be and what it is today. So thank you.
Elizabeth, you're muted.
Thank you. You would think that we would, I would have gotten used to unmuting myself these days. Thank you, Sarah, for your remarks. Our second project is the German Studies Collaboratory, which is the project in which I am involved. And I am joined here today by my colleague, John Bernd Olsen, an associate professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he teaches courses in digital history, public history, as well as German and European history. He is the author of Tailoring Truth and several articles on memory culture and the history of tourism in Germany. He is also, or was also, the editor of the website Making the History of 1989 at George Mason University. Before returning to graduate school, John worked for a member of the German Parliament and for the German National Museum, Haus der Geschichte in Bonn and Leipzig, which is his background today. Before I turn things over to John, though, I'm going to get us started with a brief introduction about how the collaboratory came into being and some of its guiding philosophy. So like many people here, shortly after the cascade of universities shifted online in mid-March, I was in conversations with other colleagues about how to manage that change. And a colleague contacted me and the other co-coordinators of the German Studies Association's teaching network to see how we might share resources to support each other in our teaching during this quite disruptive time. In that particular moment, there wasn't much more that we could do other than retweet resources and kind of keep our heads above water. At the end of the semester, though, another colleague tweeted out something about establishing a website where we could collect and share these resources. And that tweet led to a series of Friday meetings involving people from the GSA's teaching network, the GSA's Digital Humanities Network, the group Diversity, Decolonization, and the German Curriculum, and people who had various connections to the German Studies Association, the German Historical Institute, the German Academic Exchange Service, the American Association of Teachers of German, and more. So while the collaboratory benefits from its partnerships with this variety of groups and institutions, the collaboratory by intention has no real institutional home. We see ourselves as a kind of collective, guided by an emphasis on collaboration and consensus. And that ethos extends to the site itself. We've tried to break down disciplinary divisions. So the site is not organized by discipline. So for example, it's not organized with history resources in one place, Germanistik or German studies resources in the other. Instead, we have, as John will show you, hubs devoted to teaching, media, and digital projects. And those include resources from all disciplines and all interdisciplinary fields. We embrace the democratizing principle that we are better when we share our knowledge and intellectual work. And we also have sought to highlight that teaching, course design, the writing of syllabi, pedagogical strategies, assignment designs, that all of that is in itself intellectual work. As part of that, we attach Creative Commons licenses to all submitted materials, and we encourage people to give attribution when using or adapting such materials. So I'm going to turn things over to John now to introduce the different hubs and to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You also, by introducing us all, you did not introduce yourself to everyone else, but Elizabeth is the chair of the history department at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles and a specialist in German-Polish borderlands history. So real brief there, Elizabeth. So, because I don't have notes in front of me as you do. So yes, it's my job today is going to give you a quick look at what we've created. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. I don't think that worked. I'm sorry. Let's try that again. There we go. There. So the German Studies Collaboratory, in many ways, we ended up taking a very similar path from the AHA, as I just learned. When you come, though, we've broken into these three hubs. We have one devoted to teaching, one media, and one what we call the digital. And we also have a blog called Zeitnah, which means at the moment. And here we solicit contributions from across the fields. And the point of it is to have them explore how they're using the resources. So each of these blog posts go in depth into one of the resources in the collaboratory. And so if you were to go to the teaching hub, and I need to reload this, I apologize there. You can see all the different resources. Each of them come in these cards that we've created. But you can filter them. So if you're looking for an activity or a lesson framework or a lesson plan, projects for students or one-off projects, simulations, and course syllabi. And if I click on that syllabi, then it refilters and I only have the syllabi at the ready. And similar to the AHA project, everything is on submissions. And so we always ask for submissions that can come to us. And they also get vetted through various teams within our collaboratory. And then once they've been vetted, they get posted. Here in the media hub, we thought of things that are, moving. So discussions, documentaries, films, podcasts, radio dramas, and talks. We especially wanted to capture all the talks that were happening over Zoom and being recorded and then posted online. So much rich content being created because of the moment. And yet they're in all these diverse places. So here's a place where they can all come together. And then you can also search for how it's tagged, right? And then the final one, which is actually our largest, it started as sort of a catch-all for everything else. And we have bibliographies, we have blogs and document collections, exhibits and maps. And we have over 150 different entries in this group here, in this hub. And that leads to one of the challenges, or one of the next steps, is we want to create a fourth hub, which would be a research hub. And so that would probably pull out the archive document collections out of the digital hub, and the digital hub would focus much more on exhibits. And then that category of exhibits could get exploded into types of exhibits. And then the other, let me show you what it looks like. So if we go into one of these. So if we went into 100 years of the First World War, right? As editors, we vet the website. We try to create a very short paragraph description, and then it takes you to the resource. You can also look by clicking on any of these tags. It's sort of a tag cloud. You can read about migration, right? And then all of the projects that come up that are about migration will come in, right? And so the idea is to not get stuck in only looking at history resources or only looking at language teaching resources, but to cross-discipline, because we all have our collections that we draw from, but we don't need to necessarily be, hiding them from other people. And we can be inspired by how is a certain resource being used in the other discipline. And that's especially here in the teaching hub, right? And if we look at the lesson plans, right, we can see that some things are in German, but we can see, how is a historian using the refugee crisis? How is it being used in the language class, right? We do have some challenges that are facing us. One is we really wanted this to be a collaboratory. So the combination of collaboration and laboratory to see an experiment with how can we be collaborative. And so we've done that as a team of editors, I think pretty well. We've expanded to a certain extent. We have some very engaged users who interact with us and collaborate on us, but we're really trying to think out there, and we're writing an article for Central European History that explores this concept of collaboration in the digital age within German history. We also are thinking about our own workload. All of us are doing this without any funding. This was all done as volunteers, as a team. And so we have been actively applying for grants, and we came close, we feel, to getting one, but we were asked to resubmit. So that's a good sign, but we didn't quite get there. But we're hoping to be able to offload some of this, right? So how can we sustain it in the long run without either having a graduate student or some undergraduates who can work for us or being bought out? And then finally, we want to think about having a focus group as well that we want to host in order to better understand how people are using our resources, what's lacking, what needs to be added, how could we make it a better resource for everyone. So more in the Q&A, but I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Elizabeth.
Thanks very much, John. So our final project is Teaching Public History Online Working Group, supported by the National Council on Public History. And I'm going to introduce all four of the members of that working group first, and then let them take it away. So Katie Stringer-Clary currently teaches history and public history at Coastal Carolina University in Conway, South Carolina. Since 2007, she has worked with museums in various capacities, from docent to executive director. In her time at museums and as a graduate student in public history, she focused on museum education and inclusion, especially for people with special needs. Through her work, she continues to advocate for accessibility equality in museums and historic sites, especially through 3D technologies. Clary is also interested in public history pedagogy, the history of museums, museum administration, digital histories, and community engagement. Her current research is on human remains in museums. And as my students from a couple of years ago know, that I went through a period where I was all about human remains. They got a little nervous for me, I think, and historical context of those collections and exhibitions. Abigail Gautreaux joined the faculty at Grand Valley State University in 2017 and teaches history and public history to undergraduate students. Her classes partner with local institutions to complete projects, most recently the Loyola Area Historical Museum and the Grand Rapids City Archive. Prior to arriving at GVSU, Gautreaux worked on content development at the Tennessee Historical Society and digitization at the Center for Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State University. She earned a PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University in 2015, and she has worked on a wide range of communities, most notably in Selma, Alabama, and her work examines the relationship between community identity and public history. She is the author of a forthcoming chapter on the Black Heritage Council of the Alabama Historical Commission and the necessity of re-examining the roots of historic preservation. Jennifer M. Black teaches courses in U.S. history, visual culture, American capitalism, women's history, and public history at Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania. She holds a PhD in American history and visual studies from the University of Southern California, as well as an MA in public history and a BA in art history, both from Western Michigan University. Her research examines ways in which people interact with images and objects and the power of visual and material culture to influence trends in politics, the law, and society. Her work has appeared in Winterthur Portfolio, Journal of American Culture, Material Culture, and several edited collections. She serves as network editor-in-chief for H Material Culture Online and is an active public historian. She recently co-curated Anthracite Photographers of Anthracite for the state of Pennsylvania's Anthracite Heritage Museum in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and is the author of Machines That Made History, Landmarks in Mechanical Engineering. And finally, Will Stoudemire is an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, where he leads the department's public history minor and MA programs. The MA program is taught almost entirely online. He was previously an adjunct professor at Kearney, where he taught a number of online public history graduate level courses and was the director of the university's G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture. His current research and teaching interests include public history, museums and material culture, memory and identity, place, community and local history, historic preservation, and cultural resource management. He is presently working to revise his dissertation into a book manuscript, tentatively titled Preserving Our Past, Community, Heritage, and the Creation of Three National Monuments. So I think, Katie, are you up first?
I am. Yeah, so thank you. There are 4 of us. So the way we have decided to sort of break this up is we're each going to talk about a different part of our project for about 2 minutes each. So I'm getting us started and I'm going to share my screen so you can have something to look at. So what I'm talking about is sort of how we got this project started and what our project is. So I guess it was in May, sort of the end of the spring semester last year into the beginning of summer, when we all realized this isn't going away very quickly. We're going to be online a little bit longer. And there were a lot of conversations happening on Facebook, in the NCPH educators group, on our listserv, and everyone was trying to figure out, how do we do public history online? So NCPH put together a working group, and what you see here is the landing page for this working group. If someone wants to throw this up in the chat, since I'm sharing my screen, so you all have access to this. This is just a little bit about the working group. There's also a blog post that links on here and the resources, which Abby's going to talk about after me. So we all started talking about this, and there was the call for participants, and we ended up with 4 facilitators, all of us educators, and over 20 participants in our working group. So we spent the summer meeting, trying to get together and talk about what our goals were. And we were trying to figure out, how do we do something that is so community-based a lot of times, doing public history and teaching intro to public history or museum studies, or these other really hands-on courses. How do we do that in the digital realm? So we came up with a few different ideas of how to tackle this and how to come up with some resources and best practices and things for educators to use. So one thing we did was come up with project ideas. How do you best go about leading projects online? We talked about assignments. So what are some assignments that you can do digitally that you might not be, if you're used to going on field trips or doing group work out in the community, how can we do that online? We talked about technologies and different resources that are out there, Slack, what are some other ones? Slack, and different ways of communicating, Teams, Zoom, of course, ways to do sort of project management and group work online. And something else we talked a lot about is just sort of support and looking out for each other. And I think a lot of times our meetings sort of became ways for us to talk about what wasn't working, which I think is something we all needed from time to time, but also to share the successes so that we could all learn from each other. And come up with something a little bit tangible. So what we ended up coming up with by the end of the summer, so that we had it in time for fall semester, was a group of resources that are available from this link here. So they are on Google Drive. We're not quite as fancy as the Collaboratory or the AHA, but we work with what we got. So I'm going to throw it over next to Abby so she can talk a little bit more about these resources.
Okay, and I'm going to share my screen and show you those files. So this is what we ended up with. So we have a Google folder. When you land there, you'll see two different sections. The first thing that we spent our time doing was creating a collection of best practices and spreadsheets of resources. And I definitely had that already open. And so when you open that, you'll see start here and guidelines. So we have documents discussing best practices and issues and things that you might encounter if you're doing public history online. We also have, oh, hang on, sorry, the little menu thing got over my toolbar. And then we also have a collection of resources and tools. So there's a spreadsheet here with names of resources, where they're from, links, explanations about what they are, descriptions, and who it might be suitable for. And these exist for each of our kind of areas. So we have ones for general teaching online. This is the one that's geared toward public history specifically. And we have one on internships, since that was a major concern for a lot of folks, is moving internships online. And how do we ensure that students get the experience they need to do these jobs once they leave their programs, when they can't like physically go to a place and do them? So we have those. The other piece that we have here are the teaching resources, lesson plans, and projects. So these are examples of resources that people have. So if you open that, you'll see that they're broken up into kind of the major field areas that we had. Oral history, museum studies, intro to public history, historic preservation and archives. There was a little bit of kind of going back and forth about whether we should split undergrad and graduate work, since generally, particularly intro to public history, gets taught at both levels. But I think we ended up leaving everything together to let folks sort of sort out what works best for them. And then within that, we have examples of assignments. So I've pulled this one in particular for us to look at, because it's one that I used, that Andrea Burns developed. A lot of them have this kind of basic format that we developed that has like some core information about what these programs, what they do, and what the lesson is about. And then it has lists of instructions on how to do it. Oftentimes these instructions are a little bit more brief, but the idea is that there's something that's easily adaptable for you to use in your own classroom, because we all have different ways of teaching and different approaches that we use. So for example, I used this, but I like developed my own modified set of instructions because I have undergraduate students and they have a different set of needs in terms of like the level of hand-holding they need to get through an assignment like this. But they did really great work with it, and it ended up being a really great project for them to do over a couple of days. So there's a lot of resources in here. And as Katie said, it's not quite as fancy, I think, as the AHA or the German Studies Collaboratory, but I think there's a lot of good material there. And it's the sort of thing, I think a lot of us were just in a position of, oh no, what do I do? And then being able to see ideas of things people did help kind of get the ball rolling. So that's what a lot of these are. And I think we're still interested in getting submissions from folks. We did a workshop earlier in NCPH. But that's kind of, so it's still sort of growing and evolving. But yeah, that's basically the deal with it. And I will hand things over to, I think, Jen.
Yeah, so as the other projects, we also encountered some challenges and obstacles. I would say, you know, some of this has already been touched on a little bit. One thing that we initially encountered is public history, teaching public history online. Is that the same as digital history? Or is it simply delivering public history through a remote or online medium? And so we encountered some sort of theoretical hurdles. And also public history is such a broad umbrella kind of term. one of the things that, as Abby suggested, we found it challenging is that the people who participated in our online working group, their programs had vastly different focuses sometimes. Some of them were focused more on graduate or undergraduate work. Some of them were more interested in oral history or cultural resource management, whereas others were more interested in exhibits or material culture. I would say probably one of the largest challenges that our source materials now are facing is that we crowdsourced all of those resources from the people who are in the workshop. So I think, as Abby said, one of the things we would really love to do is to grow the resources that are available. So there is an invitation to submit, and we don't have a fancy submission form. We're just asking folks to email either myself or Abby. But we're taking submissions still on lesson plans and resources, and then we'll vet those and throw them up on the website in a format that's more sort of streamlined. I think, two other quick things. Some folks we found just had a sort of internal hurdle in terms of thinking about how they could convert their existing analog assignments into a digital form or remote delivery. And some of us have been doing public history, particularly some of our senior colleagues have been doing it so long that we're used to just pulling out the same materials from the campus archive or the same tactile materials and putting it in front of the students. And it's hard to really conceptualize how we would do that when you can't have them touching the stuff, right? So that was a problem. But we tried to kind of collaborate and troubleshoot and just sort of tackle things one at a time. One thing that we had hoped to do that we didn't really realize was we had hoped to have a clearinghouse for online internships. We hope to create a database that would be a sort of resource or directory for online internship opportunities. That didn't quite materialize. And the reason it didn't quite materialize is because we all of us, the facilitators and the working group participants, we all suffered a little bit of burnout by the end of the summer. We had all been going since May or March, and I see some heads nodding from my co-panelists. It's been a heck of a ride the last 12 months, and we're still not quite out of it yet. So again, we had some follow-up meetings that were really more just to support each other with members of the working group. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will, and he can talk about some of the things we want to go forward with from here.
Yeah, and so like the AHA's group and like the German Studies Collaboratory, I think our biggest hope for the future for this particular group is that this isn't a resource that stays static and that it's something we continue to grow. And my colleagues were kind of alluding to that. We really hope that this can become something where folks can come to find syllabi for courses. They can come to find lesson plans for online education, but lesson plans that can also be adapted into the classroom. And so I'm not going to go into that too much because we already talked about that as a big opportunity, but I do want to reemphasize that that's one of the big things that we really hope will come out of this group, and we'll keep it vibrant as we move forward, as we get past COVID. And echoing what my colleague said, it's this was a triage group over the summer, and we triaged together a bunch of materials as best as we could. We all did what we could to get through the fall semester, and now that we're kind of coming out of that, or maybe there at least is a light at the end of the tunnel, we're hoping to start thinking about what those future opportunities for the resources that we've pulled together can be. I think what I'd like to add to that is a couple things that I think we as a group, as co-facilitators, and from the feedback we got in the workshop that we held earlier in this conference, think are some of the lessons that we can take from this particular working group back into the classroom in the future. Because I think that's been one of the other big takeaways here, is that there may have been things that we were missing in our traditional classroom education model that we found by being forced here to do some online education and digital learning, and that we might actually want to bring back into the physical classroom. And so one of the sets of resources that came up in our workshop as possibly part of this is the list of digital tools that we've pulled together that were used in many of our classrooms, things like Slack and Perusall. that were used to facilitate collaboration between our students. And I know, like for myself in particular, our on-campus undergraduate students, I'm thinking about incorporating Slack into the classroom for them in the future when we're working on collaborative projects, because it's just such an easy way to handle communication outside of the couple hours I have them in the classroom each week. And so there are tools that we found and that we have as resources on our webpage that we really think are going to be beneficial, not just in the online format, but possibly back in the classroom. The other thing that we really found as a group was maybe something we were missing in our traditional education and our focus on our own communities, was that there are many opportunities for us to bring in speakers from across the country, and that's something that a lot of us ended up doing this particular year, bringing in speakers from across the country over Zoom to talk to our students about the work that they do, that maybe we weren't necessarily doing with our in-person classes in the past, when we were just relying on taking them to a local museum. And so we wanted to encourage folks too to think about that as an opportunity to bring back into the physical classroom. But that's all I have, and I guess at this point I'll pass it back to Elizabeth to take us into the next stage of this.
So thanks very much, everyone. All very interesting. And I think we see a lot of similarities in terms of how we're looking at things and how we're dealing with things. And I just want to highlight something that Abby put into the chat, which is that she's says that she's spent more time really thinking deeply about pedagogy in the last 12 months or so than prior to the pandemic. And I think that's definitely true for me as well. And I think for a lot of us. And one of the questions is, how much will we bring forward of that, right? Both in terms of the pedagogy in our own classes and then how we work together as colleagues. So we have plenty of time for Q&A, and we are hoping for a vibrant Q&A. You can put questions into the chat, or I think we're small enough that we can do it where with raised hands, and then I have people unmute and ask their questions if they prefer to do that way as well. There is a question already from Linda Barnacle, and apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name. Who says, maybe have, and responding to Will's point about having visitors come to the classrooms, maybe have a piece of this sort as sort of a speakers bureau, public history professionals willing to speak virtually. Abby.
Yeah, so what I wanted to say about that, Linda, yeah, that's a great thing to do. We also had spent some time this summer talking about building a library of videos of public historians talking about their careers, so that if people came to speak, you could have your students watch the person kind of do their spiel, and then they could come and do a Q&A, or if they were doing something where they were just looking at different people talking about their jobs, that would help. That's very much underway, and I will fully confess that I'm a person who did one of these interviews and still needs to edit it and put it together, because it turns out that's really time consuming. And if it's not something that I'm actively using to teach my class, then it gets pushed down on the priority list. But there's kind of a process happening there, and you can contact me if you have people. We could definitely create another spreadsheet for that, I think, in the resources for people who are willing to be contacted, and maybe list kind of the terms on which they'd be happy to talk. And then I think the way that we're handling the videos is in order to kind of reduce some of like the liability and issues with that. Yeah, NCPH has a YouTube channel. And then we're also going to be basically creating, what we'll be doing with NCPH is they'll be creating a playlist essentially where you can go and see different people speak. And so if you have a video and your organization doesn't want to host it, or you don't want to have your organization host it for like copyright reasons or whatever, you can contact me and I'm happy to put it on my YouTube channel so that NCPH can add it to their playlist.
One of the things that the German Studies Collaboratory discussed was doing just exactly this, creating a speakers bureau with digitally curated talks. And so we've added, as John showed you, we've added the talks that are out there that people have done in the world and for which there are recordings, right? We've taken advantage of the fact that webinars now make it possible for us to go to see so many more talks than we used to. And my guess is that I'm not the only person who has now a webinars folder in my email with all the links and recordings and things like that. But we also wanted to be able to commission talks about certain subjects as well as sort of things designed around pedagogy, where people would use some of the resources in the collaboratory and develop assignments or talk about their pedagogical approaches to using those things. We did apply for grants to do that. We haven't been successful there thus far, but it's something that we certainly are going to continue to do. I think and this is one of the challenges that we've found and that John talked a little bit about, is the issue of relying on sort of volunteerism. And at the same time, wanting to recognize and honor the real work and time and effort that goes into developing these resources, whether it's somebody coming to give a talk or developing a pedagogical resource or an assignment or a syllabus. And that one of the ways that we show how that is valued is through honoraria. So we wanted to find a way to get grants to give people honoraria for doing these sorts of things. And that's something that we're still hoping will come in the future. I love the idea, though, of having public history professionals come and talk about what they're doing too, right? Because it's sometimes so hard for students to imagine what they can do with a history degree. I think even for people who are specifically focused on public history, to really imagine the wide variety of opportunities available to them. And John says, also recognizing the difference of value given to such work to those within a tenure system and those who are working in adjunct positions. Yeah.
Yeah, just to elaborate one little bit, on this part, we've had lots of discussions within our collaboratory editorial group about asking untenured or adjunct system faculty to participate, because they will be doing this probably with no recognition. And so what is that ethical? And so there's some ethics that go into these discussions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And particularly, I mean, I think one of we've had, and since a lot of these focus on teaching resources too, the idea that people, teaching tends to be undervalued anyway within the system, right? And so when people put so much time and labor into their teaching work, there is a kind of sense of, am I that willing just to give it up that quickly, right? Although at the same time, I think we've all benefited from the sharing of resources. We'd love to hear more from people in the audience with questions or comments or suggestions. One of the things that we all talked about here was the kind of need for focus groups and assessment of what's going on. So we'd certainly love to hear from people in the audience about what they would like to see, what they would hope for, how, if you've used any of these resources, how you've used them. That's great for us as a kind of informal focus group in terms of how we develop these projects. So Abby's also said in the chat that part of the working group's goal was to generate resources so people wouldn't have to rely on their own networks, which of course are variable in size and things, to access content and resources and to make life easier for contingent faculty. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've been thinking about as we've gone through with the collaboratory is I think that we, and I'm guilty of this myself too, is the kind of eyes that are, what's the expression when you take too much food onto your plate, your eyes are bigger than your stomach, right? And that there are lots of really great ideas. And I think there's a question about sustainability, right? The AHA has resources as a professional organization that the collaboratory doesn't, that even the working group, even with the support of the NCPH, doesn't have in the same sort of institutional structures. So how can we sustain this kind of work when the sort of immediate need, that pandemic emergency, is no longer here, right? And in particular, as we go back to sort of more normal lives, when we can leave our homes. I don't know if those are conversations that you all have had as well, or that the AHA has had.
And we've been certainly talking about this, the question of sustainability at the AHA, because our entire site was built while we had a team of researchers on board. And the NEH Cares funding lasted through December of 2020. And although we have a no cost extension for a couple of months to finish out the project, we no longer have, a team of people who are devoted to working through resources and tagging them and writing about them. So the work of the remote teaching resources is being done amongst AHA staff on top of the usual work that we do in our day-to-day as well. And so there's the question of, how can we continue to build out the remote teaching resources under those kinds of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a question in the chat here from Sarah Rodriguez. What are the ways that you are trying to make these resources more inclusive and diverse, such as by introducing new resources that bring new voices to the table, as opposed to having the same typical voices contributing the same types of resources? Have you been able to take this into account? And if not, what are some of the obstacles to this effort? A very important question. I don't know who wants to maybe start things off there.
Well, Elizabeth, not that we dominate this discussion from our side, but I think we went into this project with actually that in mind at the very top of mind, was that we wanted to, one of the big goals of starting was to get resources in people's hands about diversifying the curriculum and decolonizing the curriculum. And so we turned to some colleagues who have a working group on decolonizing the German studies curriculum. And we brought in one of their board members to be a co-editor. And then we also brought in someone who specializes in migrant studies, so that was really always present in who we are, right?
Other thoughts?
We've also been, having conversations and drawing on the diversity of the AHA's membership and the range of topics that people teach. So early on in the project, I did a few focus groups to really talk through some of these questions with people, and that I found was particularly helpful. So I suppose our executive director likes to talk about the AHA's power to convene, and the convening of people has been really key to us being able to increase the diversity and inclusivity of the resources that we have. And the other thing was, when we were hiring the research team, I was very attentive to identifying people who were in a wide range of fields, both thematically, geographically, and era, as well as different teaching backgrounds and work in public history, so that we had a diversity of viewpoints, as well as a diversity of the networks in which they were already working. And so we really benefited from the generosity of all of the people who were willing to talk with us and to share with us.
What about our public historians here? I always think of public history as, because of the community involvement and ideas about shared authority, that this is where you, in a sense, excel as in terms of doing this kind of work. Jennifer, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, the materials that we've put together came about through this sort of open call for participants for the online summer working group. And, and having an open call is a wonderful thing, because it allows people to self-select and to sort of volunteer to do it. But it's also a limitation, because it allows people to self-select and volunteer, right? So you only get who comes to the table. And we started off with over 40 participants who wanted to be part of the group. And I think we ended the summer with somewhere around 27. And when we had a meeting We had a sort of check-in meeting after the semester ended over the winter break, and I think there were only 15 people who came. So, you know, burnout is real. And so that's not necessarily an excuse. I think one of the ways that the people who stuck with the project, at least through the end of the summer, one of the things that we were really focused on was inclusivity. And so we saw several people using the Inclusive Historian's Handbook as a not just a reference resource, but a weekly resource that they were sending students to. And that popped up on a lot of the syllabi that were shared through the resources that we pulled together. I think, you know, as you said, public historians are usually quite good at focusing on diverse voices and shared authority and community engagement. But there's certainly always work to be done there.
Yeah, and I would also interject that I think one of the challenges too is understanding that, particularly over the summer, many of our colleagues of color were extremely overburdened with the events that were going on, and along with all those things. And so I think a lot of us were reluctant to press people for service that they weren't willing to give. And the idea was sort of, you know, if we'll create these kind of baseline resources that people can draw from, that they can expand on, and there are a few here and there that deliberately focus on, like I think there's also a bibliography that was created, but was compiled, like crowdsourced compiled, that's works that are by public historians of color that you can draw from to like build a syllabus and things like that. So I think that's also a place where we've tried to kind of draw that in and make it more expansive. It's definitely like a more of a long-term goal, but it's finding that balance between having these voices be there, but also not requiring too much of people's time, particularly folks who are just like, I mean, there's so much going on, and I don't want to burden anybody with feeling like they have to come in and like fix our diversity problem.
Well, and this is where it's also about, I mean, there are the levels of in diversity and inclusion, but then also the level of equity and the power dynamics of the academy, right? So, I mean, I think, you know, there's been such great work in German studies in terms of Black German studies, Turkish German studies, Jewish German studies, and we've tried to really draw on that, as well as the work in gender and sexuality, and in highlighting some of the resources that the collaboratory has through our online presence. We've tried to, I think, focus on some of those areas that aren't kind of, so that it's not all Nazis all the time, right? Which sometimes can be a German studies default. But there also does strike me that there are just real power dynamics within the academy about the fact that faculty of color tend to be disproportionately in junior positions and especially in contingent positions, right? And so their ability to contribute and participate in some of these things is to some extent constrained by that. One of the things that, and there's also the kind of it's not exactly confirmation bias, but the default that we do, that where we often default to the big names. And when we default to big names, we're defaulting to people who are whiter and more and men. And so one of the things that in the collaboratory we tried to do to look a little, to try and counter that a little bit, is that we don't put the names of the contributors or the speakers in the titles. So they're identified because we think citation is important, right? And we want people to get credit. They're identified in the description, but not in the title, because we don't just want somebody to go through and be like, oh, that's a syllabus or an assignment from big guy at the Ivy League, I'm going to take that. And so to kind of shift some of those discussions and to make it we're a little website. We're not going to be able to transform the power dynamics of the academy, but to try and do it a little bit in terms of how we can. There's a comment, a question to Sarah from Linda Barnacle about being interested in seeing, if possible, a screenshot of your Airtable to see how all those pieces came together. She says she used it during the pandemic.
Sure, let me pull that up.
I have to say that these kinds of projects are always really useful for me because I have gone to both the public history, well, I've gone to obviously the German Studies Collaboratory site, but both the public history working group resources and to the AHA's online resources to look for things for my classes. And so just in terms of like trying to find things, they've been immensely valuable.
And I should say that NCPH resources, as well as the German Studies Collaboratory, are also discoverable through the AHA site. So we're all kind of cross-referencing one another here.
Mm-hmm.
So this is our Airtable, and it's basically divided up into the kind of information that we need to go up onto the site, as well as the kind of more back-end vetting process. So titles, hyperlinks, which person on our team it's assigned to, and then the Airtable allows for a vast number of drop-down categories. We input our descriptions, our authors, an image that we can use for the website so that everything doesn't look quite the same, and we can, really highlight that. If something was not included, we wanted to be very good about tracking why that was the case, based on our vetting rubric as well. And then status, and then kind of our, once it was approved, I would edit it. Our wonderful web and social media coordinator, Alex Levy, she would do the uploading to the website for us, and then completions. So that's the basics of our Airtable.
And as John said in the chat, in the collaboratory, we've used Trello to organize some of our work, although I'm not sure it's quite as organized as the Airtable. Amira Neely, if you want to unmute yourself, you have a question.
Yeah, hi. So I work as a community engagement coordinator at a museum. And obviously, we also, that aspect of the job got, switched up pretty drastically as well, because my community outreach has gone completely online and stuff. But something we've been struggling with is what like museums can do education wise, because we rely, pretty heavily on students coming in through field trips. And we've decided not to host field trips, at least through the end of this year, and we'll see where it goes in the future. But is there stuff that, and looking at these sorts of things you guys have created, is there either, are there resources that like can kind of help form how museums can teach field trips online? And then at the same point, is there space in these spaces for museums to provide information so that teachers can kind of like create a field trip within the classroom, and that sort of working together that way with the academic versus like museum aspect of it?
Jennifer.
Yeah, so I'll like gladly jump in there, Amira. Thanks for that question. I would say, as an educator in a small, relatively rural place, I would love to have the local institutions reach out to me. So that's the first thing I would say to you, is reach out to the local colleges, at high schools, whatever contacts you might have. You can always reach out to a chair of the department, history departments, or even cultural studies or English, or whatever, fields might be related to your museum's collections. I would say virtual field trips are awesome, and really it can be as low tech as you'd like it to be. I mean, I would be happy if someone held up their iPhone and just kind of narrated as they walked through the space. I mean, that's pretty low tech. I don't think it has to be, super wonderful or pretty around the edges. I would also say, digitization is super expensive. And we all know that. If museums have resources to digitize central pieces of their collection, that's awesome. But if you don't have those resources, a simple video tour, like I said, could be a good way around that. Another great thing would be just to organize like interactions with the classroom. I hosted a few local museum administrators in Zoom conferences with my students. So my students could kind of like meet the practitioner and ask them questions. And that took, substituted for having that person come into my classroom and give a presentation about their collections or what they do. So I think there are a lot of ways that you could be serving your community. And one first step would be to reach out and ask what people need.
I had the interesting experience of working on the remote teaching resources project while still working with the Smithsonian, which was quite a challenge with all the different platforms everyone was using, I have to say. But one of the things that we were doing at the National Museum of American History was social studies online. And that was an opportunity for people targeted towards K through 12 classrooms, but an opportunity for people working in all areas of the museum to present materials like a favorite object or a particular topic or something about the kind of work that they do. And that enabled us to bring together a wide variety of people and a wide variety of topics to connect with classrooms. That was done at the end of the 2020 semester, specifically as an effort to help teachers who were having to convert to remote teaching at that time. And those videos are still available, but I think that they're an interesting model, and they didn't require a great deal of fancy technology to do.
The head of our special collections in our library, which is obviously a different context than a museum, but has put, we always would go with visits and have a classroom session in special collections and work with the artifacts there. And she's done such a fantastic job of transforming those experiences into online experiences. So online field trips, online virtual visits, basically, using Zoom breakout rooms and Google Forms, and then photographs of artifacts. And with questions, and just, it's been so, and the students have all commented on how those sessions are some of their favorite sessions of the semester because it gives them that hands-on experience. And I think if more institutions were able to partner with whether it's K through 12 or universities and colleges to do those kinds of things, that would be such a fantastic opportunity for students and experiences. I have a student who's working on a project where she's looking at how museums have adapted in their programming to COVID, and seeing the range of differences in that process of adaptation has been very interesting. Also, I think seeing a difference in terms of how history museums have done it versus how art museums have done it. But those are, I think, really wonderful opportunities for partnerships, even if it's different from what we're used to, right? Jennifer has put in the chat as well that they'd be happy to add links to virtual tours to the databases of online resources for public history teachers. And I know that's true, I think, probably for most of our projects, certainly for the GSC as well, that those kinds of integrative sort of experiential opportunities are great resources. Other questions, thoughts, comments? The AHA too. I do wonder, like, if you could take your projects in one new direction or have one next step, what would it be like if we were to have this sort of wish list of what we wanted to do with this foundation that we've built? Because I always hate to spend labor on things and then see it go away or stagnate. And that's one of my concerns, right, about our own project, that I don't want to see it stagnate. So where would you like to take your projects?
And I think that's a pretty big question, but I'll take a first crack at it. Not to speak for my three colleagues, but I mean, you know, in a perfect world with resources and time, with several of us being, you know, tenured faculty who aren't trying just to get tenure at the moment, and so are able to dedicate time to this. You know, I think we would love to be able to build, or I'll speak on my behalf at least, would love to have a resource built where, you know, this is a little more user friendly and accessible for folks. You know, certainly both of your organizations have wonderful models in terms of just the user interface for people looking for these kinds of resources. And I'd love to be able to do something like that. I know that there were several things that we started working on over the summer, in that just, you know, fall is coming, the train is, you know, you can see the train coming down the tracks and you need to get ready. Scenario that we, you know, we started working on and we really wanted to see come to fruition, but just simply in that moment we're not able to. And that was some of the stuff that was alluded to earlier, like pulling together a large database of virtual tours of museums. You know, to Amira's question, you know, having a space where smaller institutions can record, you know, a one-time virtual tour, and that can be made available to people teaching public history across the country. I mean, that'd be wonderful to have, but that takes a lot of time and resources, of course, on both our part and on the part of the museums that we would, you know, be working with. So I think there were some big ideas like that, especially related to virtual tours. And I love this notion of getting a speakers bureau list, a list of people that you know, could come and speak to our classes, because I know that for many of us that comes through more serendipity than anything else. I've had guest speakers come to my classes because they added me on Twitter because they saw me mention that I'm teaching their book, and you know, that's great, but not but it's happening via luck, then, you know. And so it would be wonderful to have that kind of resource as well. I think you know, maybe that's something for our group to consider going forward.
Strikes me that one of the sort of opportunities here, but it will take some work, is transforming these all of these projects into, how do I want to put this, from sort of repositories where people go to find things that they need, into spaces that actually facilitate and foster and enable collaboration and projects across institutional lines. And I think in public history specifically, that would be also across the university and sort of community organization museum divide that sometimes exists as well. And so how do we make it more active, I guess, for everybody who is a user as well? And I have absolutely no answers to that, except that I know that it requires a lot of time and labor, and probably more dedicated resources than we have at the Collaboratory. And I think that's part of our challenge too, is how do we keep alive this sort of ethos of being independent and a collective, and, you know, really super democratic, and then also want to have somebody who's going to kind of take the reins, and that is needed to take the reins a little bit more with things like that. John?
Yeah, just to expand on what you were saying about our project, I think there are two different things I want to say. One is that because we don't have an institutional home, so we're not part of the German Studies Association, or the German History Institute, or the MLA, right, which are all partner organizations that we've worked with on this project, but we're not home to any of them. You know, our home isn't in any of them. We actually don't qualify for a lot of funding because we don't have an entity that can apply for these things, right? So we actually might have to create our own nonprofit in order to become an institution that's separated from these. And we've talked about hosting at one of the universities that are affiliated, but there too, we want it to be collaboratory. We don't want it to be host, you know, one person's project suddenly. So, and then I forgot, I lost the other track I think I wanted to talk about. Sorry.
Well, it's part of that kind of, I think broader questions within the academy around things like open source, and just the conversations around the nature of universities and corporate structures, but also the issues around profit and open source and open access is really what I mean there. I think I noticed that one of the criteria for the, in terms of the evaluation for the AHA was whether or not any of the materials on a site were paywalled. And that's a conversation that we've had with the German Studies Collaboratory as well. I'm sure that the Public History Working Group has thought about that as well. You know, you don't want to highlight resources that people then can't actually access, especially if they don't have the kind of permanent institutional affiliations too, right? So that they don't get caught in between those sorts of things.
I remember what I wanted to say, and that was, it's a different topic, but next steps, and I had mentioned we want to explore this idea of a research hub. And during one of our editorial meetings, one of us, I don't know who said it, but it really stuck with me, is to be able to tell an undergrad who wants to work on a research paper, go check out what is in the archive hub at the German Studies Collaboratory. You know, and that is like a really, in my mind, a real tangible goal, to create a database of archival materials that an undergrad can work their way through, navigate, and be successful with. I think that would be a really great expansion of our project.
Sarah?
That was also one of our, well, at the beginning of working on our remote teaching resources, we were very geared towards teaching, not towards research. But as it became very clear that people were going to be unable to access archives for a long time as well, we added a new tagging category of primary source collections for research papers, in order for people to know that if they went to this particular site, they would be able to find a collection that had, you know, a solid set of materials that an instructor could send an undergraduate to, and that they could work from there, or a graduate student working on a seminar paper as well. I think that was one of the largest challenges of this, was the constantly evolving tagging system that we developed, because we wanted to be as inclusive as possible without becoming too unwieldy. And I think that too is something that we'll continue to revisit in the future as teaching fields shift, as new needs are identified, and as new types of resources become available.
Definitely. So we're close to the end of our time here. So I do just want to thank Abby, Katie, Jennifer, John, Sarah, and Will for joining the roundtable here, but also really for the work of everyone on these projects. As I said, I've consulted all three of these. I mean, I'm involved in one. I've consulted the other two quite a number of times. And I do have really big hopes for how things that came about as a sort of emergency response and a rapid response to a crisis can become the foundations for really doing things differently in the future, and just such valuable resources for us moving forward in the future. I'd also like to thank our audience today. I know it's on virtual conferences are a different beast, and especially when they're spread out over a couple of weeks, it gets hard to keep in track of everything. And so thank you for joining us and for your attention and for your questions. What I'm going to do is actually stop recording, but leave the room open for a few more minutes. We are going to have to close at fairly soon because there are new people who will be using this room, just like in a real conference. But if anybody wants to hang around and ask one of those final questions where you come up to the table at the very end, we'll stick around for a couple of minutes to do that. So thank you again to everybody. Much appreciated.